Knights are perhaps the trickiest piece on the chessboard and one of, if not the hardest to master. In this video, I plan to give you basically everything you need to know about knights and how to use them effectively up to a rating of at least 2,000. We'll begin by looking at the qualities of the knights, what makes them unique, and then how to use them. Let's jump right in. Welcome to Chess Dog. My name is John Montgomery, and let's begin by looking at the unique qualities of the knight. First, knights are approximately the same value as a bishop. Now, you can do a deep dive and try to determine if there are little differences, and obviously each position will affect the value of the pieces, but generally speaking, you can be comfortable saying the knights and the bishops are of approximately the same value. Some have signed a numeric point of 3, say they're worth 3 points, say a queen is worth 9, this sort of thing. That's useful, and that can help. But knights and bishops are of approximately the same value. Number 2, knights, unlike bishops, are short-range pieces. A bishop can go from one side of the board all the way to the other in one move, but a knight cannot. Its L-shaped movement pattern means that it has a short range of movement. That, of course, is a weakness of the knight. Well, you might ask, well, then why are knights and bishops equal? Well, because of the positive attributes of the knight. The third attribute of the knight is that knights can jump over other pieces. They're the only piece on a chessboard that can do that. Not the queen, not a rook, not a bishop, but a knight can jump over other pieces. And this makes them very effective in closed positions. When the position is closed and other pieces are blocked by pawns, a knight can jump over those pawns, and it gives the knight a lot of strength in closed positions. And last, but very important, is that a single knight can control squares of both colors. If a knight sits on a light square, then it can control dark squares. If it sits on a dark square, it's controlling the light squares. A bishop that begins on a light square stays on a light square the entire game. A single bishop basically plays on a board of 32 squares, stays strictly on its square. So a light square bishop is always in the light squares, a dark square bishop always on the dark square. A knight can control squares of both colors, so its ability to jump over other pieces and its ability to control squares of both colors is what makes it equal to a bishop, even though it's a short-range piece. These are the qualities of the knight. Now let's look at the principles for using knights. We will begin by looking at principles 1 and 2 for using knights. The first principle is that knights need advanced support points in order to be effective. Now, a support point is a square that is supported by a pawn, but the knight cannot be kicked out by another pawn. If you look at this game from Max Erver, a world champion many, many decades ago, he has the black pieces here. You'll see his knight on c5 is on a support point. It's supported in this case by 2 pawns, and no other pawn can eject it from that position. The 2 pawns on the side here, they've already passed it by, so they cannot eject that knight. But there are also other support points for that black knight. b3 is a support point, supported by the pawn at a4. The d4 square is also a support point, and the f4 square is a potential support point. So that knight is well placed. So the knight on e3 for the white pieces, there are a couple of support points. One here at a6 and one here at c6. The problem is those squares, even though he could just play knight c2, b4 and aim at those squares, they're away from the action. So in order for a support point to have real value, it needs to be in the thick of things, not just on the side of the board away from where the action is. That's essential. And the knight needs to be able to get there. A rule of thumb is the further advanced the support point is, the stronger it is. usually with a support point on the 6th rank being the most powerful. 4th is powerful, 5th is a little more powerful. A knight on the 6th rank is most powerful. So that's the first principle. And the second principle is that knights thrive in closed positions when you're using knights. So let's take a look at this game and how it progressed and how Max Erver used this wonderfully placed knight at c5 to win this game. He played rook to h8. He wants to open up the h file, aiming at white's king. Queen to e2, king to g7, moving the king out of the way so that file will be open. Knight to g2. White wants to play the pawn to h4 to kick the queen away. Black plays h5 first, and now white plays h4, but now pawn takes pawn. And the queen cannot be captured because the h-pawn is pinned by the rook. fg4, now rook h4 check. Black is giving up the exchange for, basically he's giving up his rook for a knight and a pawn, but he's opening up his opponent's king. Also, he knows that this knight at c5 is actually stronger than a rook, because a rook needs to have open lines of attack, open files. There aren't really any open files for white to attack down. I mean, the h file is open, but he's in no position to take advantage of it, whereas that knight is very, very strong. Knight h4, he begins by playing rook to h8. If black just goes ahead and takes the knight immediately, then after queen h2, white is doing fine. But by playing rook h8 first, he's establishing control of that h file. King to g2, moving out of the way. He can't defend the knight, but if he played, say, rook to h3, then rook takes, queen takes, and after king g2, we see the knight already begin to be making trouble. Knight to d3. The knight aims at the e1 rook. It also aims at the f4 square, which would fork the king and the queen. So already black would be using that knight to gain material. If after rook h4, there's queen to h2, then rook h3, queen h3, and again knight to d3, hitting the rook and threatening knight f4. Rook f1, knight f4, and the knight is much stronger than the rook in this position. Maybe queen f3, queen h4 check, king g1, and the king, black king could actually march to the other side of the board, and there's nothing he can do. And black just advances the pawn, takes, and then boom, e4, hitting the queen, and the queen can't take the pawn because of knight to h3 check, and the queen would be lost. So white plays king to g2, then queen h4, g5. Now, knight to b3. Erver puts his knight on the support point at b3. Now it can aim at d4, but he has an even more interesting idea for the knight. Rook to g1, and watch this move. What a beautiful move by the knight. Knight to d2. He just hangs the knight out there. It's not even on a support point at d2. But he controls f1 and f3. That means queen to h2 would actually be checkmate. And if white takes the knight, then queen to h2 check wins the queen. The king has to move, and then queen takes queen. So that knight at d2 is beautifully placed. And after king to f2, knight takes e4 check. And black resigns. He forks the king and the rook, and black has a decisive material advantage. So that's principle 1 and 2. Knights need advanced support points to be utilized effectively, and they thrive in closed positions. Now let's look at principle number 3. Knights make great blockaders of pawns. In other words, if you need to blockade a passed pawn, a knight does a great job because it stops the pawn, but it can also still have reach because it can jump over that pawn. Look at a position like this. You see, white has what looks to be a very nice structure with an advanced pawn in the center of the board. It's protected and advanced. However, all black has to do is play knight to e8 and king f2 and knight to d6, and black is clearly better. That knight is blockading that pawn, and even though it's protected and passed, the knight can attack c4, the knight can attack e4. After something like king e2, knight c4, black is clearly better. And before the advent of computers, a position like this would have just been seen as completely winning for black. Computers might be able to find some hocus-pocus way to get a draw here with white, maybe, but basically after knight to e8, black is just clearly better, and in most human games, decisively better, because the knights make great blockaders of pawns. That's principle number 3. And finally, principle number 4 of knights. In endgames with pawns on one side of the board, knights tend to be stronger than bishops because they don't need their long-range abilities because the pawns are on one side of the board, yet they can jump and go to different colors where a bishop cannot. Here we see an example where it's a dead draw. Both sides have a bishop, but that king at e3 isn't going anywhere, and black cannot break through. This position is a draw, in contrast to this position. In this position, we've replaced the bishop with a knight. And now it's an easy win for black because that knight can just usher that pawn forward in the position before us. White's king is in check. He can control both squares, and he can keep that king from blockading the pawn. By the way, the reverse of this is true also. If pawns are on both sides of the board, the bishop tends to be the better piece in the endgame. So those are the qualities and the principles of knights. And in terms of just understanding knights, that's all you really need to know. Implementing this into a game, of course, is more challenging, but this is it, the qualities of the knights and the principles of knight play. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you're able to use some of these ideas for success in your own games. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.